I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Kelly Tu, who is an associate professor of human development and family studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She studies common stressors during the early to late adolescent years and parents' role in helping youth navigate and manage these challenges. Her research has been published widely in top journals in psychology, and we're excited to have her share this work with us in a talk titled Adolescent Well-Being, Parenting and Biopsychosocial Perspectives. So without further ado, help me welcome Dr. Tu.
Thank you so much, Andy, for the introduction and for having me here today. And thank you all for joining me on the call. I'm really looking forward to sharing my work with you and also hearing your thoughts and questions about the work that I'm doing. And as Andy mentioned, the title of my talk is Adolescent Stress and Wellbeing, Parenting and Biopsychosocial Perspectives. To give a little bit of background, my bachelor's is in psychology and both my master's and PhD are in human development and family studies. Okay. So the overarching question behind my research program is, when faced with stress, why are some adolescents more resilient, rising above challenges and continuing to thrive, while others are more vulnerable to negative outcomes, such as mental health problems or behavioral problems? When I talk about adolescent stress, I'm referring to the everyday or day-to-day challenges that adolescents might be facing, such as conflict or problems with friends, peers, and academic challenges. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on peer stress. And as you can imagine, adolescents today are experiencing increasingly high rates of stress, especially in light of the pandemic. And I'm specifically interested in adolescents because of the co-occurring biological, cognitive, and social changes happening during this developmental period. My work focuses on the role of family, peers, and individual attributes and the interplay among these three areas to identify youth who may be at more or less risk for adjustment problems in the face of stress. And the overarching goal of my work is to identify family and peer factors and underlying biophysiological processes that can promote youth well-being and positive development in the context of stress. So this leads to the 3 lines of research that I'll be sharing with you today that include parents' role in the development of youth coping, parenting by youth psychophysiology, and sleep and peer relationship experiences. Before talking about the studies that I'm going to present today and giving you an overview of the findings, I did want to give you a brief summary of the projects from which my data and my research is drawn from. You can see here the sample sizes range from 80 for a pilot study to about 250 participants. We have multiple waves of data collection. The ages for my publication specifically range from ages 10 to 16 years. There's a modest to moderate proportion of racial ethnic minorities, primarily African-American, Hispanic, Latinx, and a smaller percentage of biracial individuals, as well as Asian Americans. There's also a range of annual income across the studies, with some annual income on the lower end and others on the higher end. And all of these studies included a visit to the research lab where observational methods were used and or physiological data were collected with various tasks such as a peer evaluation and rebuff, a cognitive frustration task, or a mother-youth interaction where they engaged in problem-solving discussions. And across these studies, the focus ranged from peer stress to family aggression, coping, and biological and physiological functioning. So just to give you an overview from which my data are drawn. So my first line of research I'll talk about today is parents' role in the development of adolescent coping. And to address some key concepts, first in talking about coping, coping refers to the conscious volitional efforts to regulate emotion, cognition, behavior, and physiology and the environment in response to stressful events or circumstances, according to Compass et al. 2001. And how youth cope with stress can have implications for their subsequent adjustment, with evidence linking engagement coping strategies such as problem-focused, emotion regulation, and cognitive reappraisal with better adjustment outcomes, and disengagement coping strategies such as avoidance, denial, wishful thinking, or distraction with poor adjustment outcomes, particularly when it comes to controllable types of stressors. So it's important to understand how youth coping may develop or be socialized. There's an asterisk by support or advice seeking because it's not always categorized or conceptualized as an engagement coping strategy, It is seen as something separate in the peer stress literature, but in the academic literature, it is considered to be part of engagement coping. And so just that note there. I've assessed coping via self-reports on questionnaires, and I also have some observational data during the mother-child interaction about a peer problem as well. For the frameworks of parental socialization, so despite advancing coping capabilities and additional sources of support during early adolescence, such as from friends or peers, parents do remain important socialization agents in adolescents' lives. And so using frameworks of parental socialization, I just wanted to point out the aspects of parental socialization that I've examined and that I'll be talking about today. This includes parents' suggestions or advice about how to cope, so what to do or how to think about the challenging situation, which is at the very top here. And then this is linked to youth coping, as well as social and emotional competencies. And parents also serve as models through their own actions or coping responses, which have also been found to be linked with youth outcomes. And lastly, the parent-child relationship quality or family environment, such as the emotional climate of parent-child interactions, positive affect and negative affect that are displayed towards one another, can also influence youth outcomes as well. So when youth are faced with problems, it's not uncommon for them to receive advice to tell their parents or an adult, but the adult's advice or suggestions likely vary and could influence their coping responses and, of course, subsequent adjustment. So some examples of types of parental advice that actually map onto the families of coping that I presented earlier include suggestions such as talk with the other person to find a solution. Again, this is in the context of peer stress. And so kind of engaging and problem solving in that way. Cognitive reframing, maybe those kids are going through something right now and taking it out on others, or, trying to encourage the child, you'll do better next time. There may also be responses that fall under the disengagement category, so walk away or ignore it, try to avoid the problem, as well as assertive, so standing up for yourself. And there's also not shown here, suggestions that may facilitate negative thinking. So, those kids are just rude or mean and attributing something negative about the other peers. In my work, we've examined parents' reports of advice to hypothetical peer stress scenarios. So we give them a scenario about, say your child has been, is being picked on or teased, what kind of advice would you give them, as well as observations, again, in the mother-youth conversations about recent peer problems that the youth actually experienced. We ask them to talk about this problem like they normally would. So in one study using parents' open-ended reports in response to those hypothetical scenarios, this one's specific to the peer victimization scenario, we found that the most common responses parents gave in terms of their suggestions for how to respond was to tell their child to tell an adult, and this was primarily teachers, but could also include the principal or school counselor, to ignore it, either ignore the other kids or the behaviors that they were engaging in, to be assertive and to stand up for themselves. And then also about 30% of parents reported that they would become involved. They would talk to the teacher on behalf of the child, the principal, or connect with the parents of the bully. So collectively, across a sample of 203 participants, anywhere from 64 to 30% of parents reporting these as the most common responses that they would give their child. So in looking at the association with youth coping responses, we found that parents' responses to tell an adult, so to tell a teacher, counselor, or principal, predicted less youth-reported support seeking 1 year later, whereas parents' intervention and involvement on behalf of the child, so the parent going to the teacher, the principal, or the parents of the bullies, predicted greater conflict resolution and more support seeking from youth 1 year later. So to explain these findings, we thought of parent suggestions about telling an adult at school as potentially being more passive or disengaged on the part of the parent. So reflecting parents' inaction by advising their child to seek help from another source, as opposed to the parent being that source of support and assistance. Whereas parents' direct intervention, such as approaching school personnel, might predict more engagement coping 1 year later, because youth may perceive parental intervention as parents being responsive to their needs. They may feel a greater sense of support and connection from their parents from that response. And so they may be more likely to continue to seek advice and support about peer victimization in the future. And also, parents' involvement and intervention in the situation may serve as a model for active problem solving for youth, which could explain the association with the conflict resolution strategies. And so, as I mentioned before, in the literature, individuals who utilize disengagement coping strategies, especially with controllable stressors, are more likely to experience adjustment problems than those who are using engagement coping strategies. And so these findings about parental socialization of coping have important implications for youth coping and seeing how they directly influence how youth cope. We also find that it's not what parents say that matter, but the emotional climate of the parent-youth relationship also matters. So thinking about parents' affect towards youth and the kind of emotional climate that that creates. So in another paper that used observations of mother-youth interactions, we found that mothers who displayed more positive affect during the peer problem-solving discussion had youth who reported greater engagement coping and advice seeking with peer stress about 7 months later. We also found that greater dyadic cohesiveness, so kind of being on the same page, having similar perspectives, and sort of that in real-time interaction, that back and forth between the mother and youth, that also predicted greater advice seeking. And so we thought that rather than sort of disconnected interactions, a more cohesive interaction may uniquely facilitate more advice seeking, because advice seeking involves turning to parents for support. And so it might be more informative for this particular type of coping strategy. Other work also shows that positive affect or positive emotional climate in the parent-child relationship also provides greater opportunities for that connection between parents and youth, where youth are more likely to be open to the suggestions that mothers have and more likely to seek advice. And so in summary, across these studies, one of the key takeaways is that parents' direct intervention and cultivation of a positive parent-adolescent emotional climate could promote greater adolescent engagement coping with peer stress. Some ongoing work with the observational data that we have is thinking about, what type of advice are mothers giving in real-time problem-solving discussions. This is something that we've been looking at in terms of the content of what parents, specifically mothers and youth, are talking about in these problem-solving discussions. And a key thing that I'm really interested in is to what extent are youth receptive or open to parents' advice. So parents may be giving engagement, coping suggestions. They may be giving some great advice to their kids and to their teens. But if the youth are not receptive or open to hearing that advice, then the effect or the influence of parents' advice, may be less impactful. And so really thinking about the implications of youth receptivity for their adjustment and well-being. And so with mom's advice being coded, we can look at, in a real-time conversation, how are adolescents responding and what are they even saying when mom gives a suggestion. So that is underway. And so my next line of research takes a biopsychosocial approach to understanding youth adjustment in the context of stress, with this work broadly guided by the developmental psychopathology framework, with the idea that individuals exhibit or have risk and protective factors that may interact with their environment to predict adjustment. And environment, in this case, I'm framing as parenting. So building on what I presented regarding adolescents' voluntary or behavioral coping, another way in which we examine youth responses to stress is physiologically. through parameters of the autonomic nervous system. The ANS is the regulatory branch of the central nervous system. It's considered to be the control system, which regulates internal organ functioning and muscles in the body. This system is proposed to reflect awareness and responsiveness to environment, and as well as supporting behavioral and emotion regulation, both of which are involved in stress responses. And the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, is divided into two branches, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is often referred to as the rest and digest system, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is referred to as the fight or flight system. So how does this system work? Porges proposed a hierarchy of system responses of how our bodies respond to stress that I'll summarize here with regards to relevance for the work that I'm presenting. So at the top here under normal non-threatening circumstances, the parasympathetic system, or the PNS, is active, maintaining homeostasis. And the parasympathetic influence on the heart is through the vagus nerve, which stems from the brain. And we can think of the vagus nerve like a brake on the heart, where under normal non-threatening circumstances, vagal tone to the heart is high. So we're applying the brake and it's slowing heart rate. And so this serves as a calming function to promote growth and restoration. It also allows for social engagement behaviors because the nerves that influence the heart are also linked with muscles of the face and head, which govern speaking, listening, orienting, attention, all things that are necessary for engaging socially. And a measure of vagal tone is respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which refers to variations in heart rate across a breathing cycle. So high vagal tone or high vagal tone or high baseline RSA is thought to be adaptive under this framework. Next, then, in mild to moderately stressful or challenging circumstances, maybe such as giving a presentation or talk, the vagus is withdrawn, the brake is let up or released, allowing for a moderate increase in heart rate. And this allows for active coping and engagement with environmental demands. And so the withdrawal of the parasympathetic or the PNS influence, or vagal or RSA withdrawal under these circumstances, is considered adaptive. So again, releasing that brake to allow for an increase in heart rate. And so this is considered to be adaptive, this withdrawal when you're faced with a mildly stressful or challenging circumstance, as compared to maintaining that brake and maintaining that parasympathetic influence on the heart. And then lastly, in high stress circumstances, the sympathetic nervous system is activated, or the SNS. This mobilizes the body's resources to respond to stress, which has a higher metabolic cost. It is not compatible with social affiliation. So if you're thinking about flight or flight, you're not going to be thinking about carrying on a conversation necessarily. An example I've used in the past, which is kind of on the extreme end, say you're out camping and a bear comes across your campsite, what are you going to do in that situation? So we can also think of the SNS responses along a continuum from extreme fight or flight responses at the higher end to less extreme levels of arousal at the lower end, such as arousal from more typical day-to-day stressful experiences, of which skin conductance level, or SCL, may be an indicator. So I also want to note that SNS activation isn't a bad thing. Sympathetic arousal can support engagement with a stressor. The other thing I want to note is that these systems are not mutually exclusive. So it's not the case that if the PNS is demonstrating higher activity level, that the SNS is necessarily showing low activity level. Both could be demonstrating or exhibiting high activity level, or both low activity level. And so just wanting to make note of that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And polyvagal theory also proposes that psychophysiological dysfunction or underarousal could contribute to the emergence of psychopathology and adjustment problems. And so this leads into some of the work that I've done. And so specifically for studies that look at parasympathetic nervous system activity, across a few studies, with 2 independent samples, we examined the moderating role of low baseline RSA and RSA augmentation in the link between parenting and youth adjustment. So low baseline RSA or low vagal tone and RSA augmentation to stress. So in a stressful situation, not releasing or withdrawing that parasympathetic influence in order to be able to actively cope or respond to the stressful situation is considered to be a physiological vulnerability. And so among the youth who demonstrated either low baseline RSA or RSA augmentation to stress, in 2 studies using the same sample, we found that this served as a vulnerability factor in the context of negative parenting, specifically psychological control, where it was associated with more internalizing symptoms 7 months later for these youth, as well as less positive affect from parents during that mother-youth problem-solving discussion, where we saw lower levels of engagement coping reported 7 months later. But we also found in an independent sample that these youth who demonstrated specifically RSA augmentation, they benefited or gained the most from parental management of friendship. So more specific guidance about who to be friends with. We found that they had less problematic friendships and less negative peer experiences about 1 year later. And so we interpreted these findings as youth RSA augmentation in the context of challenge or stress perhaps reflected a need for parental support and needing more of the guidance and boundaries to create those positive peer spaces in that particular study. So again, the key takeaway here, risk for maladjustment with negative or less positive parenting, but potential benefits for more supportive guiding parenting through parental management. We found a similar pattern of findings for our sympathetic nervous system indicators, where SNS under-arousal in response to stress or environmental challenges is conceptualized as a potential indicator of insensitivity to social cues in that environment and may be a risk for maladjustment. So given a stressful or challenging context, the fact that they're not aroused where typically other people are may be a sign that there's something that they're not picking up on in that context, which might contribute to maybe behaviors or responses in that situation that others wouldn't expect there, and so that being a potential risk. So across 3 independent samples, 2 with early adolescence and 1 with late adolescence, we found that parental involvement in the form of more engagement coping suggestions, as shown in the first figure here, and management of friendships, which is referred to as parental directing in these other 2 figures. We found that for youth who exhibited sympathetic underarousal, as indicated by low skin conductance level reactivity, when parental involvement in the form of more engagement coping suggestions and management of friendships was associated with better peer adjustment. So less peer victimization, fewer deviant peer affiliations, and more positive peer affiliations among these adolescents. And so what we're seeing here is that under-aroused youth, similar to RSA augmentation, may benefit from more involved parenting in terms of engagement coping suggestions, as well as parental management of their peer context. So parents providing more direct guidance about how to cope or who to affiliate with may be particularly beneficial for youth who are exhibiting under-arousal in the context of challenge. So thus far, the work I've presented examines one system at a time. Currently, we're investigating the contributions of multi-systems, so multiple systems of the ANS, given that both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, as I mentioned before, are not mutually exclusive. So one way of doing that is looking at specifically the cardiac measures of the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. And we're doing that in one study with which is referred to as cardiac autonomic functioning. And there are two indicators that can be calculated from the physiological parameters, looking at, on one hand, the dominance of either the SNS or the PNS, so seeing which system is dominant either at baseline or during a challenge task. And the other is cardiac autonomic regulation. And this is taking into account what is the activation level or the activity level of both systems, again, at baseline or during a challenge task. And so are both systems activated or are both systems inhibited? So giving a sense of that co-activation and co-inhibition, how are these systems working together? And so one of my students presented at Society for Research on Child Development this past spring, looking at the interaction between youth coping responses and cabin car in the prediction of youth adjustment. She's working on that as a manuscript right now. And then I have another student who also presented at SRCD, but really looking at parenting behaviors. So looking at mother's sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity and how that is related to observations of their autonomy, support, and control during those mother-youth interactions. So both of these from the same data set. So those are some things that we're working on right now to give a more holistic picture of what's happening in the ANS system. My third line of research focuses on the link between sleep and peer relationships. Sleep is a bioregulatory process that's linked with emotion regulation, physiological regulation, and I'm interested in how predictive of and I'm interested in sleep and how it's predictive of and an outcome of peer experiences. So adolescents, and probably many of us on this call today, do not get enough sleep and or experience sleep problems, whether it's trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up a lot in the middle of the night. And so for adolescents, this coincides in part with delayed sleep phase that's associated with changes to adolescent circadian rhythms that's tied to puberty and maturation, where they have both later bed and wake times. And sleep, especially in young children, have been examined in the context of the family, with the family being a proximal influence in children's sleep, such as setting bedtimes and routines. But for adolescents, I've also been thinking about the role of peer experiences, given the increasing importance and value of friendships and peer relationships as youth are transitioning from childhood to adolescence. So although friends or peers may not be physically present in adolescents' homes, during bedtime, adolescents today are connected through technology and social media. So really thinking about the broader social context of sleep informed by this adaptation of the figure on the left of the bio-ecological model. So where you see the arrow pointing, really thinking more broadly about the social context of adolescent sleep. Additionally, sleep and arousal are opposing systems of arousal regulation. So you can imagine that both negative and positive experiences can increase arousal, both physiologically, cognitively, that could potentially disrupt sleep. So if you're, really excited about something happening the next day, like you're thinking about it, that could keep you up. If something really negative happened to you, that also may be on your mind and could also interfere with being able to sleep. So those are some guiding frameworks for this work. And so across two independent studies of young adolescents, I found differing patterns of effects. I'm going to pause just for a second. I don't know if you can hear, my son is homesick today, and so he's calling for me. I will be right back. I apologize. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so in looking at the link between sleep and negative peer experiences across two independent studies of young adolescents, I found differing patterns of effects. The first is that peer victimization predicted poor sleep quality across the span of 1 year. And this is consistent with some other literature that's starting to look at the link between peer victimization and bullying and a broad range of health indicators. And in another study, we were able to test bidirectional associations, which we weren't able to test in the first study. And I actually found that poor sleep quality predicted more peer victimization 7 months later, but not the reverse. So again, not necessarily consistent with the first study, although we weren't able to test reciprocal associations in the first study. So that could be something that is a part of it. But for the findings with the second study of sleep problems predicting more peer victimization, this does seem relatively consistent with theory and some empirical evidence in which thinking about sleep as being linked to behavioral and emotion regulation. So more sleep problems could exacerbate or increase adolescents' risk for peer victimization because of poor behavior and emotion regulation that affects maybe how they interact with and respond to their peers, and particularly in situations of peer victimization. And then extending beyond negative peer experiences, in the same study as the second set of findings I just presented, we also wanted to look at positive peer experiences and kind of shift also to include that lens as well. And we actually did find support for bidirectional associations where more sleep problems predicted less positive friendship experiences about 7 months later. But we also found that more positive friendship experiences or positive peer experiences, predicted fewer sleep problems 7 months later. So adolescents with more positive peer relationships, we think may be less likely to experience like that heightened level of arousal and distress that youth who have negative peer experiences might experience that could interfere with sleep. And so they're less likely to experience that arousal, less likely to have that sleep interference. So having fewer sleep problems. And then similarly, fewer sleep problems may be associated with more positive peer relationship experiences because better sleep and better sleep quality specifically can facilitate or enable better behavioral and emotion regulation, as well as more positive mood, which again could translate to more positive interactions with peers and friends, and thus promoting better peer relationships over time. And so across these studies, I think we definitely need some more replication here to really kind of tease apart the direction of effects, but some evidence from my work and others as well, identifying both sleep and peer experiences as influencing one another and pointing to multiple ways to support well-being in these areas for youth. Some limitations and future directions, as I mentioned before, replication of findings are needed, and to further build on the gaps that are present in the existing studies to really get a sense of whether these patterns hold. Also including larger, more diverse samples. Again, the sample ranged from 80 to 250 across these studies. But in thinking about more diverse samples, thinking about diversity in relation to race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and the samples that I used in my studies were community-based samples who were relatively well-adjusted. We didn't see, a lot of negative parenting or psychological control in that way. And so it's worth thinking about, what do these processes and patterns look like with higher risk samples? Who may have the most to gain regarding parental support, maybe parent training, as well as coping skills for youth. And thinking about the value of investigating within group processes, which is related to another bullet point here of thinking about cultural awareness and sensitivity regarding the kinds of questionnaires that we use, the types of questions that we ask, our observations of parenting and how we're coding different parenting behaviors and the meaning of that, and thinking about parent-youth interactions. So really thinking about other ways to account for contextual and cultural factors that could provide a clearer understanding of youth coping, physiology, and parenting. Just as an example of this, thinking about parental warmth and the way that it is the way in which we capture it in sort of more Western cultures and what that looks like may be very different or not evident in other cultures, or even the things that parents might say to their kids, I've had students who've said, in my family or in my culture, like, we don't even have a translation for that. Like, this is not something that parents would say. So we really have to be mindful about, how do we take these research findings when we talk about application and implication and informing programs, what does that really look like and who is it really serving based on the research that we've done? And then also thinking about more inclusivity and less bias in data coding and analysis. And so thinking about the treatment of race and ethnicity as a covariate if it's not a primary study variable. We recently have been talking more about in our lab, coding it. We used to, and you probably saw in some of the findings, we had are they ethnic or racial minority, yes or no, and it was a dichotomous variable. That puts together multiple racial ethnic groups that, are very different. And there's also, of course, within group differences, and really thinking about effect coding and this reference about how doing effect coding may help to decenter that typical white as the norm or the reference group. And so just thinking about some basic, simple things that we can do on an analysis level. And of course, there's a lot more, as I mentioned before, but really thinking about how we're looking at our data, how we're presenting it. And then of course, some longer term studies beyond 2 to 3 waves and looking at different developmental periods as well. So maybe middle childhood, maybe the transition into emerging adulthood. Some key takeaways from my 3 lines of research include that parental involvement and engagement advice can facilitate youth engagement coping and advice seeking. So parents can model engagement coping strategies and seeing that benefit there. Parents can also equip youth with the specific skills to cope with stress. And that more parental management versus negative or controlling parenting can promote better adjustment among physiologically dysregulated or under-aroused youth. So this can equip youth who may be insensitive to social cues with specific skills to cope with stress and steer these youth towards more positive peer context. So having more of that positive peer influence. And then lastly, positive peer relationships and healthier sleep behaviors can facilitate positive functioning in the other, which can be informative for programming and interventions around healthy peer relationships and sleep hygiene and practices. And again, as I mentioned before, contextualizing this in community-based samples with relatively low levels of severe or chronic problems with peer relationships and with sleep, and overall low levels of negative parenting, predominantly white samples, although we do have a relatively larger percentage of racial ethnic minorities from these community-based samples. So I'd like to thank the funding agencies as well as my graduate and postdoc mentors, as well as the families who participated across these projects, and a special shout out to my research team, both my graduate students and undergraduate students who have made this work possible. And thank you all for your time.